Summit fever, an overpowering obsession with reaching the top of a mountain, can cloud a climber's judgment, often with fatal consequences. On K2, the world's second highest and deadliest peak, this psychological grip turns into a dangerous gamble. With unpredictable weather, steep ice walls, and perilous avalanches, K2 demands perfect timing and calculated decisions. Yet, many climbers push forward, ignoring the warnings, consumed by the desire to stand at the summit. This video uncovers the haunting stories of those who succumbed to summit fever on K2, where ambition and obsession collided with nature's unforgiving power. What drives people to risk everything for a fleeting moment on the top? Let me tell you about what happened on K2 in August of 1995, a story that still gives you chills when you hear it. K2 is the second highest mountain in the world, but climbers say it's even more dangerous than Everest. On August 13th, Allison Hargreaves, a 33-year-old British climber known for her amazing solo climbs, was among those who set out to reach K2's summit. The morning at Camp 4, high on the mountain at about 8,000 meters, seemed promising. The weather looked fine at first, and the climbers felt hopeful. Allison joined a mixed group of climbers from different teams. Among them were Rob Slater from the United States, Bruce Grant from New Zealand, and 3 Spaniards, Javier Olivar, Javier Escartin, and Lorenzo Ortiz. Everyone shared a single focus: to conquer K2. Even though things seemed calm, some climbers like Peter Hillary, son of the famous Sir Edmund Hillary, noticed signs of trouble. Clouds were building in the distance, and the weather in the Karakoram Mountains could change fast. Peter decided it wasn't worth the risk and turned back. Allison and her group, though, kept going. Their determination was like a force of its own, pushing them higher up the slopes toward the bottleneck, one of the most dangerous parts of K2. The bottleneck is a narrow, icy path with massive hanging ice blocks called seracs overhead. These seracs can break and fall without warning, and everyone knows this is the point of no return. But the team pressed on, reaching the summit late in the afternoon, around 6 or 7 p.m. It was a huge achievement for them, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Sunset was close, and the weather was starting to turn. Being on an 8,611-meter peak in the dark is a deadly gamble, and the climbers were about to face the consequences. As they began their descent, the storm hit. The wind roared at speeds up to 260 kilometers per hour, and snow lashed at them from every direction. At that altitude, the air is already thin, and with such strong winds, it feels impossible to breathe. It was complete chaos. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the temperatures were so cold they could kill in minutes. At Camp 4, 2 of the climbers, Lorenzo Ortiz and Pepe Garces, had stayed behind. They were too tired to try for the summit and were huddled in their tent trying to survive the storm. But the winds were so strong, their tent shredded apart, leaving them exposed to the freezing cold. They had no sleeping bags and no real shelter. They somehow managed to survive the night by lying in the snow, trying to keep each other warm. The next morning, when the storm calmed a bit, they began their descent. As Lorenzo and Pepe made their way down, they found heartbreaking signs of what had happened during the storm. They saw pieces of gear scattered across the ice: an anorak, a climbing boot, and a harness. These items belonged to Allison. She had been caught in the storm and swept away by the fierce winds near the summit. The Spaniards also spotted a body far below on the mountain, but they were too weak and frostbitten to investigate. They were completely drained when Lorenzo and Pepe reached Camp 3. What should have been an 8-hour climb took them over 2 days. They had frostbite and were barely able to move. Eventually, they were rescued and airlifted off the mountain, the only survivors from their group. The rest of the climbers, including Allison, Rob Slater, Bruce Grant, Javier Olivar, and Javier Escartin, were never seen again. Their bodies remain on K2, lost to the mountain forever. Allison's purple jacket, decorated with flowers, was later found, but it was one of the only pieces of her left behind. Peter Hillary, who had turned back earlier that day, described what he thought had happened. He believed summit fever had taken hold of the group. This is when climbers become so obsessed with reaching the top that they ignore all the warning signs around them. He remembered seeing the clouds building and the danger growing, but the group kept pushing on. Once they reached the summit, they were so far into the danger zone that getting back safely became almost impossible. Allison Hargreaves was a mother of 2 young children and one of the most accomplished climbers of her time. Earlier that year, she had become the first woman to climb Mount Everest without oxygen or Sherpas. Many admired her courage and skill, but others criticized her for taking such risks as a parent. On K2, her determination to prove herself and fulfill her dreams ended in tragedy. Just like Allison Hargreaves, another climber whose life ended tragically on K2 was Frederick Ericson, a Swedish mountaineer known for his daring spirit and love for extreme skiing. Frederick wasn't just climbing mountains, he was redefining how they could be conquered. But K2, often called the Savage Mountain, is a place where dreams are just as likely to be shattered as they are fulfilled. Frederick's passion for combining skiing with mountaineering had taken him to some of the most dangerous peaks in the world. In 2004, he became the first Swede to ski down an 8,000-meter peak when he descended Shishapangma in Tibet. He followed that achievement with descents of other massive mountains, including Gasherbrum II in Pakistan. But his ultimate dream was something no one had accomplished before: skiing down from the summit of K2. It was this dream that brought him to the Karakoram range in August 2010. On the night of August 5th, Frederick, along with his climbing partners Gerlinde Kaltenbrunner from Austria and Trey Cook from the United States, prepared for their summit push. They had reached Camp 4 at around 8,000 meters, a place where the air is thin and every breath feels like a struggle. The conditions were less than ideal. The wind was howling, visibility was poor, and the temperatures were bone-chilling. But the weather forecast predicted an improvement later in the night, so the three climbers decided to take the risk. At 1:30 a.m. on August 6th, the team left their tents and started their ascent. The goal was to reach the summit before noon and then make their way down. Time was critical. Any delays could mean descending and worsening weather, which was a death sentence on K2. Frederick carried his skis strapped to his backpack, determined to achieve his lifelong goal of skiing down the mountain. As they climbed, the situation became more difficult. Snow covered the path, and strong winds blew through the bottleneck, a steep and narrow section of the route. Trey, who had frostbite from earlier climbs, decided to turn back. He returned to Camp 4, leaving Frederick and Gerlinde to continue on their own. By this time, the visibility was still poor, and the wind showed no signs of letting up. Frederick took the lead as they climbed toward the summit. He was carrying ropes and looking for a secure place to anchor them. Near the bottleneck, around 7 a.m., he reached for a small outcrop of rock to secure a piton, a type of climbing spike. As he placed the piton, a rock dislodged from the icy slope. The sudden movement caused Frederick to lose his balance. Without a rope to catch him, he fell. He tumbled down the icy slope, plunging nearly 1,000 meters before disappearing from view. Gerlinde watched in horror but couldn't help him. She quickly descended, hoping to find some sign of him. Along the way, she found one of his skis, but there was no trace of Frederick himself. The poor visibility made it impossible to see the base of the slope where he had fallen. Other climbers who were stationed lower on the mountain reported seeing Frederick's body far below, near Camp 3 at around 7,200 meters. However, the terrain was too dangerous to reach him. The area was unstable, with avalanches and ice falls threatening anyone who tried to traverse it. As the news spread through the climbing community, Frederick's death was met with an outpouring of grief. Those who had climbed with him remembered him as a strong and optimistic mountaineer who inspired everyone around him. His body was left where it fell, at the request of his family. They believed Frederick would have wanted to remain among the mountains he loved so much. Frederick's story is another example of how summit fever, the overwhelming desire to reach the top, can lead to fatal decisions. He was an experienced climber who understood the risks, but even the most skilled mountaineers can fall victim to K2's brutal conditions. And yet, in February 2021, K2 claimed more lives in a tragedy that would once again highlight the dangers of chasing the summit. This time, it was Muhammad Ali Sadpara of Pakistan, John Snorri Sigurjonsson of Iceland, and Juan Pablo Mor Prieto of Chile. The three were last seen on February 5, 2021, as they attempted to summit K2 during one of its most perilous seasons, winter. Scaling K2 in winter is a challenge so extreme that only a handful of climbers had ever dared to try, and until just weeks earlier, no one had succeeded. Ali Sadpara was no stranger to high-altitude climbing. A celebrated mountaineer, he had summited 8 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks and was part of the first team to conquer Nanga Parbat in winter. His name was revered in mountaineering circles, and in his home country of Pakistan, he was a national hero. Alongside him was John Snorri, an experienced climber with a dream of making history by summiting K2 in winter, and Juan Pablo Moore, known for his skill and determination. Ali's son, Serge Sadpara, also joined the expedition, but would later play a crucial role in piecing together the events that unfolded. The team left Camp 3 on February 4th, intending to reach Camp 4 at around 8,000 meters, positioning themselves for a summit push the following day. The weather window they were working with was razor thin. Winter on K2 is unforgiving, with temperatures dropping to minus 60 degrees Celsius and winds that can reach hurricane strength. This brief window of calm was set to close by midday on February 5th, but the climbers pressed on, hoping to achieve their historic goal. As they reached the bottleneck, the narrow, steep passage just 300 meters below the summit, Sajid encountered a problem. His oxygen regulator malfunctioned, leaving him with no choice but to turn back. Ali, John, and Juan Pablo decided to continue without him, confident they could complete the climb and descend before the weather worsened. Sajid made it back to Camp 3, where he waited anxiously for the team to return. The last confirmed sighting of the trio was near the bottleneck at around 10 a.m. on February 5th. It was a bright, sunny morning, and from base camp, the summit seemed tantalizingly close. But as the hours passed with no sign of the climbers, concern began to grow. By nightfall, it was clear something had gone terribly wrong. Rescue efforts began the following day, but the conditions on the mountain made it nearly impossible. Helicopters flew over the upper slopes, searching for movement or signs of the climbers, but the harsh winter weather thwarted their attempts. Experienced mountaineers attempted to trace the trio's route on foot, but all they found were scattered pieces of gear, tents, sleeping pads, and other items that didn't belong to the missing climbers. Sajid later shared his belief that the team likely reached the summit. However, the descent from K2 is often more dangerous than the climb itself. Exhaustion, altitude sickness, and rapidly deteriorating weather can turn a triumphant moment into a life-or-death struggle. Sajid speculated that his father, along with John and Juan Pablo, were caught by the cold or ran out of oxygen during their descent. The tragedy struck a deep chord worldwide. Tributes poured in for Ali Sadpara, John Snorri, and Juan Pablo Moore, honoring their courage and dedication. Ali's legacy, in particular, resonated strongly in Pakistan, where he was remembered not only as a skilled climber, but also as a kind and humble man who had inspired countless others to dream big. The search for the climbers officially ended on February 18, 2021, after weeks of relentless effort. Sajid, along with the families of John and Juan Pablo, expressed their gratitude to the Pakistani authorities, the military, and the global mountaineering community for their support. Ali Sadpara's body, like so many others lost on K2, was never recovered. He rests on the mountain he loved, a symbol of the indomitable spirit of human adventure. Summit fever may drive climbers to push beyond their limits, but on K2, the margin for error is almost non-existent. It is a place where nature always has the final word. For Serge Deso, a seasoned climber and Montreal firefighter, this truth became devastatingly clear during his second attempt to conquer the Savage Mountain in July 2018. Serge wasn't new to the challenges of K2. He had attempted the climb in 2016, but was forced to abandon the mission after a massive avalanche wiped out Camp 3. The mountain had shown its fury, and Serge had lived to tell the tale. Yet, the experience didn't dissuade him. If anything, it fueled his determination. He returned to K2 in 2018, leading a 9-member international expedition that aimed to summit both K2 and Broad Peak. His dream was not just personal. He wanted to be the first Quebecer to have climbed both Everest and K2. In early July, Serge and his team prepared for the grueling ascent. The weather was better than in 2016, though far from perfect. Their plan was to push higher when a favorable summit window opened later in the month. To acclimatize, Serge, along with teammates Nathalie Fortin and Maurice Beaujour, climbed to Camp 2, located at approximately 6,700 meters. They planned to spend the night there before descending to base camp to wait for better weather. The climb to Camp 2 wasn't easy. The route passed through House's Chimney, a notorious section of K2's ascent. This narrow, vertical crack in a rock wall demanded precision and focus. Climbers had to trust their ropes and equipment completely, knowing a mistake here could be fatal. Serge and his team made it safely to Camp 2, where they spent a cold and restless night. The next morning, on July 7th, they began their descent. Serge, ever the leader, started ahead of Natalie and Maurice. As he navigated the treacherous terrain, something went catastrophically wrong. Witnesses later suggested that an old fixed rope might have snapped or failed. In a matter of seconds, Serge lost his footing. He fell over 300 meters down the rocky slope, just below House's chimney. The impact was fatal. Back at Camp 2, Natalie and Maurice didn't immediately know what had happened. They followed Serge's path, descending slowly and carefully. When they reached the scene of the fall, the horrifying reality sank in. Serge's body was retrieved by high-altitude porters and brought to advanced base camp. News of the accident spread quickly, shocking the climbing community and devastating his team. Serge's death left a profound impact on those who knew him. Friends and colleagues described him as a passionate and careful climber, someone who respected the mountains and never took unnecessary risks. His experience and determination were evident in every climb he undertook, but K2's unforgiving nature had claimed another life. The expedition ended in tragedy, with the remaining members deciding to abandon their climb and return home. For Serge, the summit fever that brought him back to K2 was not about recklessness or bravado. It was about challenging himself, conquering his fears, and achieving a dream. But on K2, even the strongest climbers must face the mountain's ultimate authority.